Chapter 1. What West African indigo dyers did to keep fabrics cool. Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. You might be expecting tales of kings and queens, of dynasties and intrigue, but tonight, we're going to wander into the world of fabric. Not just any fabric, but indigo-dyed cloth from West Africa, and specifically, the peculiar, quietly genius ways these artisans kept their fabrics cool. So, dim the lights, settle in, maybe stretch out on your bed, and let's drift slowly into a world of dyed threads and languid sun-soaked afternoons. Imagine a bustling village somewhere along the Niger River, centuries ago. It's hot. Not just, oh, it's warm hot, but the kind of heat that makes your sandals stick to the dust and your shirt cling in all the wrong ways. And there, under the intense West African sun, people are working with indigo, a plant-based dye that stains your fingers blue almost immediately, like some sort of harmless magic trick. But indigo is temperamental. It doesn't like the sun glaring down directly on freshly dyed cloth, and it doesn't particularly enjoy being soaked for too long. It's finicky, like a royal child whose only whim is that someone fetch a harp to play while they nap. The dyers had to be clever. They discovered that by weaving special shades into their drying racks and creating these little shaded zones, the fabric could cool down naturally. Shade wasn't just shade, though. They'd position the cloth in areas where air could drift through, lightly caressing the fibers, and sometimes they even draped pieces over slightly damp reeds. The effect was subtle, almost meditative. The cloth relaxed, the dye settled, and the indigo deepened in color, like a slow sigh of satisfaction. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Cloths, cooling racks, riveting. And yes, in a way, it's not exactly scandalous palace gossip or tragic royal drama. But here's the thing, the very survival of indigo's brilliance depended on this delicate choreography. Without it, the color would fade unevenly, and the whole point of wearing or trading that deep blue would be lost. In a society where indigo cloth was currency in fashion and trade, keeping the fabric cool was, in essence, an act of quiet heroism. Some villages even had subtle hierarchies when it came to who handled the cooling process. Elders, naturally, took the first pieces, fabrics destined for ceremonial robes or special gifts. The young apprentices got the more mundane stuff, which, ironically, gave them more freedom to experiment with innovative cooling methods. One young apprentice reportedly tried draping cloth over a thin layer of clay, noticing that the slight moisture and porous surface created a kind of natural air conditioning effect. Others followed suit, and suddenly, there was a small, almost invisible culture of microengineering within the village. The sun wasn't the only challenge. Heat from the vats themselves, where the indigo had been fermented, was another problem. Indigo vats, if you've never encountered them, look deceptively calm. A deep, dark, liquid blue that almost seems to absorb light, but beneath the surface, microbial life is busy at work, breaking down the plant matter into something usable. Touch it, and your fingers get dyed instantly. And yes, the vats give off warmth, enough to threaten the freshly dyed fabric if left too close. So the dyers became quite precise, moving pieces in and out with a rhythm that, if you imagine it, is almost like a gentle dance. And they weren't hasty about it. Unlike some people I could name, historical monarchs who couldn't wait 5 minutes for dinner, let alone an important treaty, the dyers understood patience. Cloth had to rest, sometimes for hours. A piece could be laid across a reed, allowed to breathe, rotated just so. One misstep, like leaving it under direct sunlight for too long, and the results were, at best, disappointing and at worst, a total loss. Losing a piece of indigo fabric was like misplacing a crown jewel. Only less tragic, but still worth a sigh. Interestingly, the techniques were deeply regional. In Mali, you might find the cloth suspended from poles arranged in zigzags, which allowed air to swirl in unexpected ways. In Nigeria, dyers might set up the cloth under large banana leaves, which provided shade and a tiny bit of natural humidity. And in Burkina Faso, some used clay tiles laid over the drying racks to create a slow cooling effect, almost like a medieval air conditioner, but quieter and far less noisy than the modern kind. This focus on cooling also influenced social interaction. People didn't just handle cloth in silence. They observed, commented, and advised. A dyer might peer at the rippling folds of indigo and say, "Ah, this one prefers a light breeze from the east." Which, again, may sound whimsical or like the sort of advice you'd give a pet plant, but over centuries, these small observations became part of a shared knowledge system. Knowledge that ensured every piece of fabric reached the precise depth of color intended. It's the kind of slow, methodical genius that deserves a little sleepy admiration. And speaking of color, indigo itself is a rather remarkable companion in this story. Derived from the leaves of the indigofera plant, it starts as a soft green slurry that slowly transforms into that deep, vibrant blue. The cooling process doesn't just preserve the dye, it enhances it. As the fabric cools, oxidation occurs more gently, allowing a richer, more stable color. Too fast, and the cloth might end up splotchy. Too slow, and it might become overly stiff or unevenly saturated. The dyers, naturally, learn to read the subtleties of each batch, understanding that the wind, the shade, the humidity, all of it mattered. It's also worth noting that these processes weren't just about aesthetics. Indigo cloth carried social and economic weight. A brilliantly dyed indigo robe could signify status, be part of a bride's dowry, or serve as a gift to a visiting dignitary. In some cases, dyed cloth itself was currency for trade. Which, when you think about it, means that keeping fabrics cool was not merely a technical concern, it was a quiet act of economic stewardship. One might even argue that these dyers were the original unsung bankers of their communities, making sure that every roll of cloth was flawless. And yet, despite all this careful attention, accidents happened. Sometimes a sudden gust of wind would toss a delicate piece of fabric into the dust. Or a sunbeam would creep through the leaves, striking the cloth for just a moment, altering its shade. One could imagine the dyer standing there, hand on hip, sighing softly, muttering something akin to, "Of course, because why not double down on mischief today?" These small disasters were, strangely, part of the rhythm. The unpredictability demanded patience, humility, and a certain zen-like acceptance of imperfection. Let's float over to another curious aspect, the materials themselves. The fibers varied, from coarse cotton to finer woven threads, each responding differently to heat and light. Coarser threads might handle the sun a little better, while finer fabrics required meticulous placement to avoid uneven fading. Dyers learned the personalities of the fabrics, much like one might learn the quirks of an especially fussy cousin. Some fabrics, they realized, thrived under gentle, filtered sunlight. Others seemed to sulk if handled incorrectly, taking longer to settle into their final hue. There was also the nighttime strategy. Because West African days can be blistering, some dyers left their fabrics to cool overnight, taking advantage of cooler air and softer breezes. This approach worked particularly well for delicate ceremonial garments or fabrics intended for important markets. The air at night was slower, gentler, less likely to shock the dye. The effect was almost meditative. By morning, the cloth had absorbed not just color, but a sense of calm, the kind of calm that made it almost pleasant to touch. Which, in turn, made buyers, who probably appreciated subtler things like texture and sheen, happy enough to part with a few coins or trade goods. And, of course, there was always a little competition. Dyers from neighboring villages would peek at each other's methods, sometimes with subtle envy. One village might have discovered that hanging cloth from a certain angle produced an unusually deep blue. Another might have experimented with layering fabric over slightly wet banana leaves, achieving a shade that seemed to shimmer in early morning light. These observations traveled slowly from mouth to ear, from market to market, building a quiet culture of experimentation and refinement over generations. Even more fascinating was the role of rhythm in the drying and cooling process. There were certain times of day when the sun was just harsh enough to encourage evaporation without risking discoloration, moments when the breeze from the river carried a gentle hint of humidity, and subtle changes in temperature that could make or break a bash. The dyers learned to read these signs intuitively. No watches were needed, only careful observation, honed over years of experience. Time itself became a flexible, breathing part of the process, bending to the needs of cloth rather than dictating them. And in case you're wondering, yes, the dyers did occasionally get impatient. Sometimes, young apprentices would sneak pieces into direct sunlight, hoping to speed up the process. Predictably, the fabric often came out blotchy or uneven. The elders would shake their heads, mumbling something like, patience is a virtue, and also a way to keep indigo from sulking. Mistakes were minor, usually, but they reinforced a slow, contemplative approach. Every piece that survived the day's sun and air was, in a sense, a quiet victory, proof that calm attention could yield beauty. By now, you might feel your own body relaxing, tracing invisible paths through the village, past vats, drying racks, and gently swaying indigo cloth. The heat, the air, the subtle blues, the whole environment seems to breathe slowly, like it knows you're settling in for a long, slow drift. And that's precisely the magic here. The dyers, without intending to, created an almost hypnotic rhythm with their work. A rhythm that celebrates patience, subtlety, and the quiet satisfaction of as we continue floating along the indigo-dyed world. It's worth noting that the cooling methods weren't just practical, they were, in a way, a form of artistry. You might think of art as paintings, sculptures, or music, but here, art was patience, observation, and respect for subtlety. The very positioning of a cloth on a drying rack could transform its final hue from merely nice blue to deep, contemplative indigo, like the sky just after sunset. Every fold mattered. Every breeze counted. And of course, the dyers were well aware of the drama inherent in these gentle manipulations, even if it wasn't the kind that involved swords or intrigue. Some villages developed small rituals around cooling, almost as if the fabric were a living entity that required reverence. They would whistle softly while rotating a particularly fine piece, or tap lightly to ensure it hadn't adhered too tightly to the reeds. I like to imagine that in some cases, the cloth might have preferred the rhythm of certain songs over others, because why not? Indigo has a long history of inspiring subtle human behavior, and it's not hard to see how these rituals became woven into the cultural fabric of the villages themselves. The weather, naturally, played its part. Monsoon winds, occasional heat waves, or even unexpected light rain demanded improvisation. Dyers had to anticipate these small disasters, or at least accommodate them gracefully. Some learned to pivot, moving fabrics under temporary shelters or adjusting the orientation of racks to capture gentle breezes while avoiding rogue sunbeams. In a way, it's a little like being a conductor in an orchestra of sunlight, wind, and fiber. Only instead of violins and trumpets, you have the whisper of cotton, the murmur of reeds, and the slow, patient oxidation of plant-based dye. Interestingly, cooling methods could vary even within a single village, depending on the dyer's own temperament. Some preferred the ultra-gentle method, long drapes over wide racks where air barely stirred. Others were a little bolder, using angled poles to capture maximum airflow, risking a slightly uneven tone for the sake of efficiency. There was no universal correct way, only guidelines and accumulated experience. And as always, small mistakes were treated with calm tolerance. Nobody yelled. Nobody stormed out. It was more of a collective, sighing acknowledgement that sometimes the universe, or perhaps the wind, had other plans. Now, let's float over to the dyes themselves. Indigo is remarkable not just because of its color, but because of the complex chemistry happening quietly inside the vats. The dyeing process involves fermentation, oxygenation, and careful monitoring. One misstep, like over-agitating a vat, could cause the color to oxidize too quickly, resulting in muted or uneven tones. And once a fabric emerged from the vat, it was alive with possibility. Cooling wasn't just a technical necessity, it was a bridge between raw potential and perfected artistry. Every fold, every careful rotation of cloth was like a whispered conversation between human patience and botanical chemistry. One technique, used extensively in parts of Senegal and Mali, involved layering fabrics over wet mats made from local grasses. This created a kind of natural cooling chamber. The mats slowly released moisture, keeping the air immediately around the cloth slightly damp and cool. As the sun moved across the sky, the dyer might subtly adjust the height of the racks or the angle of the fabric, ensuring an even cooling rate. It's the sort of meticulous, gentle choreography that could only exist in societies accustomed to thinking long-term, to valuing precision without urgency. And, of course, there was hierarchy in the cooling process too. Certain fabrics, like ceremonial robes for high-ranking elders or cloth intended for market sale to visiting traders, received extra attention. These pieces were often rotated more frequently, draped more carefully, and observed more closely. Less important pieces, practice cloth, for instance, were left to follow a more relaxed schedule. This subtle prioritization speaks volumes about the social organizations surrounding indigo dyeing. It wasn't chaotic or arbitrary, it was calm, efficient, and quietly clever. Some dyers also discovered that different fabrics preferred different cooling strategies. Coarser weaves might withstand direct sun a little longer, while delicate weaves benefited from partial shade. There are accounts, passed down through oral histories, of dyers who could tell just by touch or smell whether a cloth was ready to move from one drying rack to another. It's easy to imagine this skill taking decades to cultivate, like the gentle, meditative mastery of a Zen gardener. And yet, even with all these subtle techniques, accidents were inevitable. A sudden gust of wind could carry a delicate cloth into the dust. A stray sunbeam could intensify briefly, causing a slight shift in tone. Even experienced dyers would sometimes stand back, hands on hips, and mutter under their breath about the whims of fortune. And in that gentle acceptance of imperfection lies another lesson. Patience, attention, and humility are often more important than control. Cooling also affected the texture of the cloth. As fabric relaxed in the shade and airflow, fibers settled into place, creating a softer, more supple hand. This was critical for garments, as softer fabrics were more desirable and comfortable to wear. Buyers, whether from local communities or distant markets, could tell the difference. A perfectly cooled indigo robe wasn't just deep in color, it was pleasant to touch, easy to drape, and carried an unspoken aura of care and attention. Even after the cloth was cooled and ready, the story didn't end. The folded, packed fabric had to be transported, often over long distances and in challenging conditions. Traders and travelers were advised to keep bundles in shaded areas, to avoid sudden exposure to sun or heat, and to handle cloth gently to avoid friction or stress that could mar the dye. This careful consideration extended the life cycle of the indigo, preserving both beauty and value. And there's a subtle rhythm in the very idea of cooling cloth. The dyers weren't racing against time, they were conversing with it. Morning breezes, afternoon sun, evening humidity, all of these became part of a slow, fluid schedule. The fabric dictated its own pace, and human hands followed, adjusting, observing, guiding without force. It's the kind of slow, mindful work that almost invites the observer to slow down as well, to notice the gentle rhythm in the air, the subtle dance of light and shadow across folds of cloth. Perhaps most fascinating is how these methods reflect broader cultural values. The emphasis on patience, subtlety, and care is mirrored in other aspects of life in West African villages. The same calm attention given to cooling indigo was often reflected in farming practices, cooking, and craftwork. Nothing was rushed unnecessarily, and mistakes were met with gentle correction rather than harsh punishment. It's a quietly radical approach when compared to the frenetic pace of modern life, where instant results are expected and patience is scarce. There's also a poetic element to consider. Imagine a piece of cloth, freshly dyed, swaying gently in the breeze. The sun filters through leaves, casting soft patterns on its surface. A dyer rotates it slightly, ensuring even exposure, while another peeks at a particularly stubborn section, nudging it just enough to coax it into submission. Hours pass, unnoticed, in this quiet, almost hypnotic rhythm. By the end of the day, the cloth has changed, not dramatically, but subtly, beautifully, like the slow fading of twilight across a calm landscape. And yes, there's a little irony here. The very techniques that preserved the brilliance of the dye were, in a sense, anti-dramatic. There were no sudden shocks, no bold gestures, no attention-grabbing tricks. Everything relied on gentle observation, tiny adjustments, and an acceptance of imperfection. For something so aesthetically striking as indigo-dyed cloth, the process to achieve it was almost boring, if you'll forgive the word. Boring in the best sense, of course. A deliberate, slow, careful attention to detail that rewards patience and mindfulness. As the day drifts to evening, you can imagine the village calming down. Dyers check their racks one last time, adjust a few fabrics, and begin to tidy their tools. Indigo-stained hands are washed, vats are covered, and the gentle blue hue of the fabric, cooled just right, seems to glow softly in the fading light. Even the wind participates, brushing across the drying racks, as if acknowledging a job well done. And in this calm, steady world, there's a lesson for us, quietly embedded in the folds of the cloth. Patience matters. Observation matters. Small, careful actions can yield beauty far beyond what brute force or hurried effort could achieve. Cooling indigo isn't glamorous in the traditional sense, but it's a reminder that the quiet, methodical work of human hands can create something enduring, something valued, something soothing. Even if you've never dyed a piece of cloth in your life, you can feel the rhythm. You can sense the heat of the day, the gentle sway of fibers in the breeze, the patience required to coax a perfect color from stubborn plant matter. It's the kind of world that invites slow breathing, quiet attention, and gentle reflection. And isn't that exactly the kind of story that makes you want to sink a little deeper into your pillow, feel the slow drift of time, and let your thoughts float quietly, like leaves on a calm river? And so, as the sun sets on our imaginary West African village, the fabrics cool and settle into perfect indigo. The dyers relax, perhaps sharing a quiet laugh over an errant piece that didn't behave, or murmuring advice to the next generation about the subtle art of cooling. And somewhere in the gentle folds of those textiles lies a kind of serene satisfaction, an echo of centuries of patient hands, observing, adjusting, nurturing. The story of cooled indigo cloth is, in the end, a story of care. A story of patience. A story of understanding subtlety, of working with natural rhythms, and of quietly mastering a craft that mattered not just for commerce, but for culture and beauty. It's a reminder that sometimes, the slow, careful path produces the most enduring results. A task done well. Now, as we drift further into the subtleties of West African indigo dyeing, it's interesting to note the indirect ways this slow, patient work mirrors the oddities of historical elites. Though, of course, without the scandal, treachery, or half-baked Habsburg potatoes. Let's linger there for a moment, because even though we're talking about cloth, the parallels are oddly soothing. Consider the obsessive attention required by dyers. The slightest misalignment, the smallest oversight, could alter the final outcome. Now, swap indigo for a crown, and you have a glimpse into the preposterous lengths monarchs went to ensure perfect appearances, ceremonial robes, political alliances, or dynastic continuity. But unlike those high-stakes dramas, where failure could lead to wars or palace intrigue, here, a misbehaving indigo cloth merely earns a sigh, a gentle correction, and a chance to try again. It's almost meditative to observe. In some ways, the very patience of indigo dyeing seems a quiet antidote to the chaos of royal households. Take, for example, a royal family in medieval Europe, where dynastic marriages were planned like intricate chess games, each alliance a potential catastrophe. One might imagine a palace scribe feverishly noting the correct placement of a ceremonial gown while an anxious monarch frets over succession, wondering if the subtle angle of a folded sleeve could impress a visiting dignitary. Contrast that with a village dyer, calmly adjusting a fold of cloth in the breeze, observing sunlight through leaves, and everything suddenly feels a little serene. The physical rhythm of the dyer's work is worth noting. Morning light, afternoon air, evening shade, all these natural forces dictated a gentle schedule. Compare this to the frenetic, sometimes absurd routines of royalty, where a single meal might involve dozens of attendants, each performing precise, laborious gestures to ensure nothing is out of place. In West African villages, the rhythm of indigo dyeing is unhurried, flowing, almost musical in its consistency. There's no urgency, no screaming chamberlain, no frantic attempts to preserve appearances at all costs. Just patient hands, quiet observation, and an ever so slightly amused awareness that nature will ultimately have its way. Of course, no discussion of indigo cooling would be complete without acknowledging the variations in technique. Each village, each dyer, had slightly different methods, developed over generations. Some layered fabrics over damp mats, others positioned them to catch gentle breezes. Some relied on reeds, others on the subtle humidity near riverbanks. And yet, despite these differences, the core principle remained the same. Observe carefully, adjust subtly, and let the cloth respond at its own pace. This mirrors, in a curious way, how different royal courts developed their own microcultures, rituals, and obsessive practices, each idiosyncratic yet serving a similar overarching purpose: control, beauty, and order. Sometimes, a dyer would notice that a particular piece of fabric resisted cooling in the usual way. Perhaps it was thicker, or more tightly woven, or just moody. Gentle experimentation followed, adjusting position, changing height, tilting the rack. In some cases, a stubborn cloth might demand a full day's observation, almost like a fussy royal child whose moods could not be predicted. And the patience required was, admittedly, impressive. You can imagine the dyer sipping water, hands blue from repeated handling, murmuring softly about the idiosyncrasies of this stubborn piece. And somehow, after all that careful attention, the cloth emerged perfect. There's something quietly satisfying in that. A lesson, perhaps, in humility and persistence. Let's float briefly over to the social implications. Indigo cloth carried status and value, much like a finely embroidered robe in a European court. Ceremonial pieces were treated with special care, often handled by the most skilled dyers, rotated meticulously to ensure even cooling. Less important pieces were left to follow more relaxed routines. This subtle hierarchy reflects a broader societal awareness of quality and importance, reminiscent of how courtiers or palace attendants might assign priority to certain garments, foods, or ceremonial objects. Only here, thankfully, no one's head was at stake. The environmental factors were another quiet challenge. A sudden gust of wind could toss delicate cloth into the dust. Unexpected sun could bleach a section unevenly. Dyers learned to anticipate these small disruptions and respond calmly. In some ways, this required more intelligence than brute force: gentle observation, awareness of shifting light and air, and a willingness to adjust without frustration. Compare that to a monarch who might order punishments, send envoys on frantic errands, or demand immediate obedience. The dyers, by contrast, are models of measured, almost Zen-like calm. And speaking of Zen-like calm, consider the tactile aspect. Touching a cooled piece of indigo is soothing, the fibers relaxed, soft to the hand, ready to drape perfectly. It's a quiet reminder that patient work produces not just visual beauty, but tactile satisfaction. Contrast this with royal garments, often stiff with layers, embroidery, or precious metals, designed more to impress than to comfort. Indigo cloth, in its simplicity and subtlety, seems almost meditative. There's a rhythm to it, a flow that invites the observer, or listener, to slow down and notice the tiny, deliberate gestures that create lasting quality. Interestingly, some dyers developed what we might call anticipatory skills. They could sense, just by observing early evaporation, how a piece of cloth would behave later in the day. Adjustments could be made hours in advance, rotating the fabric slightly, shifting it toward a breeze, or adjusting its height relative to surrounding materials. It's a gentle form of forecasting, almost like meteorology, but far calmer and less urgent than the courtly attempts to predict allegiances, inheritances, or wars. The cloth, in essence, teaches patience and foresight simultaneously. There's also a subtle form of storytelling embedded in the cooling methods. Each village had slightly different approaches, and these methods were passed down orally, often with a touch of narrative flourish. Place it near the river when the morning wind whispers, and it will deepen in shade. Rotate it slowly under the banana leaves, and it will drink the night. These are not merely instructions, they are gentle stories, a narrative rhythm that teaches patience and observation, embedding culture in craft. And unlike some royal chronicles, these stories don't demand attention with fear or scandal, they reward quiet reflection. As fabrics cooled, the dyers often observed minor quirks, a section that resisted even airflow, or a fold that absorbed dye differently. They adjusted subtly with tiny nudges or repositioning, and in doing so, developed an intimate understanding of their materials. One might even say that the fabric taught them, requiring attention and respect. It's a slow feedback loop, the kind that fosters mindfulness, subtle awareness, and a gentle sense of satisfaction. Contrast this with royal households, where errors could lead to public scandal, punishment, or humiliation. In the world of indigo cooling, mistakes are softly corrected, lessons absorbed, and life continues, blue, calm, and steady. There's also a beauty in the uniformity achieved. After careful rotation, cooling, and occasional adjustments, the fabric emerges evenly dyed, perfectly softened, ready for folding, transporting, or ceremonial use. This uniformity is quietly impressive because it's achieved without force, without harsh interventions, only by understanding the properties of fabric, air, and light. It's subtle mastery. No one cheers, no one documents the triumph in grandiose chronicles. Yet, the result is a thing of beauty, appreciated by those who understand and notice. Even more fascinating is the way cooling influenced trade and social exchange. Fabrics that had been cooled properly had more value in markets, could be used for higher status garments, or traded for better goods. The dyers' patience translated into economic influence, quietly shaping social hierarchies. While kings and queens might manipulate alliances with intrigue or coercion, here, mastery over a natural, subtle process produces tangible, lasting benefits without drama. And yes, we can even glimpse a hint of humor in all this. Imagine a dyer, blue-stained fingers, gently nudging a stubborn piece of fabric, muttering something like, "Of course you'd resist, because why not?" There's a faintly sarcastic acknowledgement that life is unpredictable, materials are moody, and patience is required. It's a small, human moment, reminiscent of the quiet irony found in the lives of historical elites, though thankfully without the consequences of dynastic collapse. Another small point worth noting is collaboration. Cooling often required 2 or more people for larger pieces. They would coordinate movements, adjust positions, and observe together, developing a kind of quiet, synchronized workflow. There's a gentle rhythm here, a flow of energy and attention shared across hands, almost like a slow dance. Compare this to royal courts, where coordination often came with tension, whispered suspicions, or outright conflict. The dyers' collaboration is harmonious, calm, and unhurried. Finally, as evening approaches, the fabrics rest. The air cools, shadows lengthen, and the dyers step back to admire their work. There's no ceremony, no grand declaration. Just quiet satisfaction. A piece of cloth, perfectly cooled, soft, deep indigo, ready to fulfill its purpose. A small triumph of patience, observation, and subtle intervention. A story that unfolds slowly, deliberately, and almost hypnotically. And so, as we let our minds drift over these drying racks, gentle breezes, and softly glowing fabrics, we can feel a sense of calm. The meticulous care, the subtle adjustments, the quiet hierarchy of attention, all of it invites slow breathing, gentle focus, and a sense of temporal suspension. The story of cooling indigo cloth is, at its heart, a story of human patience, observation, and quiet mastery. It's also a story that naturally leads us toward broader reflections, the human fascination with control, perfection, and beauty. In the world of indigo, control is exercised softly, through observation and subtle adjustment. Perfection is sought not through force, but through patience. And beauty arises quietly, almost imperceptibly, over hours and days. Contrast that with the lives of kings, queens, and nobles, who often pursued control and beauty with urgency, drama, and sometimes tragic results. Here, the lesson is gentle. Slow, mindful attention produces something enduring and quietly admirable. Let's start by observing a curious phenomenon, the obsessive focus on purity of blood that European royal families maintained for centuries. Because apparently, keeping power within a family required ignoring the fact that DNA doesn't care about crowns. You might have heard of Charles II of Spain, often cited as one of history's most unfortunate outcomes of inbreeding. He was called the Bewitched, A title that sounds ominous but is really just polite commentary on a man whose physical and mental development was, let's say, severely compromised. Charles II's family tree is a knotty diagram of repeated marriages between first cousins, aunts and nephews, and assorted other close relatives. The goal was simple: consolidate power and maintain wealth. The outcome, however, was less simple. Charles was born weak, fragile, and often ill. His jaw protruded in a way that left him unable to chew properly, and his body didn't develop as expected. And yet, because dynasties cared more about bloodlines than basic human functionality, he was king. Imagine being handed the crown while your jaw can't even properly close. That's leadership, apparently. Now, Charles II wasn't alone. The Habsburg family perfected this approach across generations. They even earned a reputation for what modern geneticists would call predictable disaster. One of the more famous Habsburg traits was the pronounced Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw combined with a strong overbite. It's the sort of facial feature that becomes a family trademark, especially when passed along relentlessly due to careful cousin marriages. It might be considered fashionable for portraits, but in practice, it caused difficulties in eating, speaking, and, perhaps most importantly, producing heirs. And speaking of heirs, the obsession with keeping the bloodline pure often led to tragic consequences. Infant mortality was high, child marriages were common, and families often mourned multiple members simultaneously. Royals were expected to marry young, sometimes arranged as toddlers, with the expectation of producing the next generation of rulers. If you think about it, it's not exactly the kind of system that nurtures healthy, happy lives. Yet it persisted because the stakes of dynastic continuity were considered higher than the health of any individual. Let's drift over to another curious case: the Egyptian pharaohs of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, wasn't just a cunning diplomat, she was also the product of repeated sibling marriages. Her family tree is a tangle of brother-sister unions, which, again, seems like a reasonable way to manage succession if you're ignoring the genetic consequences. Cleopatra herself was reportedly intelligent, charismatic, and politically adept, but it's worth noting that her family environment was as strange and insular as any palace could be. Power and bloodlines were intertwined to such an extent that normal social interactions were minimal. Moving north, we encounter the Scandinavian royals. The medieval kings of Denmark and Sweden often married within the small circle of European nobility, creating similar, if slightly less extreme, inbreeding patterns. These families prided themselves on lineage purity, sometimes arranging multiple marriages between the same few families over generations. Children of these unions were often fragile, temperamentally unpredictable, or prone to early illness. One might imagine palace tutors quietly sighing, noting, "Yes, another delicate little prince who will likely require constant supervision." And of course, the courtiers dutifully observed and nodded, because what else can you do when fragility is baked into the system? Back in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella's descendants continued the trend. Their insistence on cousin marriages ensured that wealth and power stayed consolidated, but it also left heirs with health problems that were, in retrospect, unsurprising. Chronic illness, deformities, and early deaths were common. And yet, the court persisted, because maintaining control was deemed more important than producing robust children. Dynastic obsession, it seems, trumps even basic biological sensibility. It's worth floating over to a minor curiosity: the small principalities of Germany. Because Germany was divided into so many tiny states, the aristocracy often married within incredibly narrow social circles. Cousin marriages were not the exception, they were the norm. It wasn't unusual for a prince to marry someone barely distinguishable from a sibling, genetically speaking, because marrying outside the tiny circle of ruling families threatened alliances. So even in relatively obscure regions, dynastic inbreeding created children with fragile health, odd physical traits, or unpredictable temperaments. Court historians dutifully recorded these facts, but in the grand scheme, survival of the family line was considered paramount. Let's linger on one particularly illustrative example: Queen Victoria of England. She herself was married to her first cousin, Prince Albert, in a union celebrated for its domestic harmony and cultural influence. However, the long-term effects of marrying within such a narrow gene pool are evident in her descendants. Many European royals in the 19th and early 20th centuries bore the marks of this careful cousin marriage policy. Hemophilia, most famously, spread through royal families like an unwelcome guest, earning the nickname the royal disease. Hemophilia doesn't make for exciting gossip in small doses, but when you multiply it across multiple dynasties, it becomes, well, historically significant, if somewhat quietly tragic. And speaking of quiet tragedy, let's drift over to the Bourbon family of France. The Bourbons were famous for their intricate, sometimes absurdly convoluted, web of cousin and half-cousin marriages. Their obsession with preserving bloodlines often resulted in marriages between very young children, sometimes with betrothals arranged before either child could walk or speak coherently. The goal was clear: maintain power, keep titles within the family. The consequences? Children born with fragile health, early deaths, and lifelong infirmities. Court life continued as though nothing were amiss, because duty and protocol outweighed individual well-being. There's also a subtle humor in observing the way these families managed appearances. Portraits were carefully commissioned to show strength, beauty, and regality, often masking the frailty, deformities, or odd physical traits that genetic obsession produced. One might look at a Habsburg painting and note, ah, yes, perfectly noble profile, shame about the jaw, and in that small sigh, glimpse the ironic tragedy of dynastic obsession. Beauty, power, and health were treated as separate, loosely correlated variables, and the court accepted this quietly. Another fascinating point: personality quirks. In families so isolated by custom and expectation, eccentricities multiplied. Shy, timid, overly anxious, or conversely aggressive and volatile, children raised in these dynastic bubbles were often ill-prepared for normal social life. Tutors and attendants did their best, of course, but social skills weren't exactly prioritized over lineage or ceremonial training. One can almost hear a courtier muttering, "Yes, another prince who insists on arranging his forks in perfect symmetry before breakfast," which, to be fair, is a reasonable coping mechanism given the bizarre pressures of royal life. In some dynasties, the obsession with bloodlines reached literal absurdity. Marriages were arranged between uncles and nieces, double cousins, and even half-siblings. In hindsight, these unions appear as almost comically tragic experiments in human genetics, with predictable results: children who required constant care, suffered from chronic illness, or displayed physical deformities. Yet for centuries, the system persisted, because the concept of political expediency outweighed biological sense. Every child born was a potential future ruler, and failure to produce heirs in the right way was considered a scandal worse than death itself. And here's the thing: even within these tightly controlled, obsessively managed dynasties, unpredictability persisted. No amount of cousin marriages could guarantee a healthy heir. Nature, with its quiet indifference, had the final say. And that, in a way, is where the dark irony lies. Centuries of careful planning, endless genealogical calculations, and obsessive marital arrangements often produced fragile, sickly, or tragically short-lived individuals. The dynastic obsession with purity was always at odds with the randomness of human biology. Meanwhile, ordinary people lived relatively unremarkable lives nearby, enjoying fresh air, normal marriages, and occasionally, the occasional errant blue fabric from distant trade routes. While royals fretted over marriage contracts, Indigo Dyers perfected the subtle art of cooling cloth. Both pursuits require patience, both reward observation, but one produces quiet, enduring beauty and the other, complicated genealogical charts. Let's pause for a moment to float over to the Scandinavian courts again. Kings and queens there sometimes displayed similar patterns, though tempered by smaller populations. Children were married young, alliances were tightly controlled, and eccentricities abounded. Some rulers were described as moody, melancholic, or prone to odd behaviors. Court historians recorded these quirks dutifully, noting how small temperament shifts could ripple through entire political networks. And yet, unlike the carefully managed indigo cloth, There was no gentle airflow or patient cooling to ensure smooth results. Nature, in this case, was merciless and entirely uncooperative. To be fair, in some instances these royal oddities could produce competent, even brilliant rulers. A few dynasties managed to combine careful bloodline management with political acumen, though these were exceptions. More often, the story is one of fragility, eccentricity, and quiet tragedy wrapped in the glimmering ceremonial trappings of wealth and power. Observing them with calm detachment as we are, the tale becomes almost soothing, like watching clouds drift lazily across a summer sky. You know, tragic clouds, but clouds nonetheless. Let's drift further into the personal lives of these monarchs, where the combination of fragile genetics, dynastic obsession, and palace etiquette produced some unusual outcomes. Take, for instance, the French Bourbons. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was famous for his absolutist rule and his meticulously staged court life. Everything was theatrical, from dining to dancing, but behind the grandeur was a man obsessed with control. Control over appearances, over etiquette, and, naturally, over his descendants. Louis XIV's children and grandchildren were, by most accounts, remarkably ordinary humans, prone to illness, quarrels, and the occasional scandal. Yet in public, they were expected to embody perfection. Some had minor deformities or awkward mannerisms, the kind that court painters were trained to smooth over in portraits. One can almost hear the painter mumbling under their breath, "Ah, yes, the tiny imperfection that no one must notice, of course." And so the court continued, a blend of precision, ritual, and quiet absurdity, all aimed at masking the biological realities of the family tree. Moving eastward, let's linger for a moment on the Habsburgs again. Charles II has already been mentioned, but the pattern repeats. Physical frailty, mental delays, and pronounced deformities were frequent. And yet, the family kept marrying close relatives, generating further generations of what could politely be described as challenging heirs. They were surrounded by courtiers, tutors, and attendants, all trained to manage their daily lives with almost surgical attention to detail. A king could not lift a cup unaided. Someone was always on hand. A prince drooled excessively due to jaw misalignment. That, too, was quietly managed. The entire household functioned like a slow-moving, highly organized support system. It's oddly reminiscent of a monastery in terms of discipline, only with more embroidery. Across the Channel, the Stuarts of England exhibited similar tendencies. Charles I, Charles II, and their extended family were deeply intertwined in courtly intrigue, marital politics, and personal eccentricities. Health problems, early deaths, and occasional temperament explosions were common. One might imagine a young Charles II pacing quietly in a palace corridor, muttering about minor inconveniences, while courtiers tiptoe around, prepared for both whimsy and disaster. There's a gentle humor in picturing it from a distance. Humans doing the best they can in utterly ridiculous circumstances, guided by social and political imperatives rather than common sense. And it wasn't just health or temperament. Quirks abounded in everyday habits. Louis XV of France, for instance, reportedly obsessed over small comforts and personal routines. Doors had to open a certain way, meals were conducted with careful ceremony, even the placement of furniture could provoke irritation. In some ways, these tiny obsessions are reminiscent of the patient, careful adjustments we discussed with West African indigo dyers. Small interventions, repeated over time, shaping an entire environment. Only here, the stakes were more social than chemical, and the consequences involved palace gossip instead of perfectly dyed fabric. Meanwhile, in Austria, Maria Theresa's court was meticulously organized, with strict protocols dictating the daily lives of her children. She was a master of routine, ensuring education, etiquette, and succession planning proceeded with relentless precision. And yet, even within these structured routines, children were often frail, prone to illness, or temperamentally unpredictable. There's a faintly amusing image of young archdukes and archduchesses navigating daily schedules with the same awkward energy that a toddler might bring to a carefully choreographed dance recital. The difference, of course, is that failure could have political consequences, not merely a dropped baton. It's also worth noting that many of these royals developed eccentric coping mechanisms. Some became obsessive about cleanliness, others about repetitive movements or rituals. These habits, often necessary to impose a sense of control over a life constrained by protocol, resemble in a way the careful attention dyers gave to indigo cloth. Rotate too fast and the fabric, or air, misbehaves. Rotate too slow, and the result is unsatisfactory. The principle of small, deliberate interventions applies in both cases, albeit with vastly different stakes and consequences. Let's pause for another royal illustration, the Medici of Florence. The Medici family, famed for banking, patronage, and political maneuvering, also had their share of personal quirks. Children were raised in highly controlled environments, often isolated from ordinary social interaction to protect both health and propriety. Mental fragility, physical weakness, and emotional volatility were quietly managed by tutors and guardians. Court life resembled a slow-moving chess game, where every smile, frown, and cough could be interpreted for political or social significance. There's a quiet absurdity to it when viewed without the emotional stakes. Humans managing humans with meticulous care, always alert to the slightest deviation from protocol. Even minor nobles were not immune. Across Europe, countless smaller principalities demanded careful observation of behavior, protocol, and appearance. Children were monitored closely, and any hint of illness or oddity required immediate intervention. Tutors, attendants, and family members acted like slow-moving machines of attention, correcting posture, adjusting speech, or ensuring appropriate reactions to social cues. In this sense, the palace itself functioned as a slow, controlled environment, much like the careful arrangement of cloth for optimal cooling. Only here, the fabric was human temperament, and the consequences could ripple across dynasties. And then there's the curious case of personal tragedy intertwined with routine. Many royal children lived short lives, often succumbing to illnesses that modern medicine would handle easily. In other cases, mental health issues, exacerbated by isolation, expectation, or inherited fragility, shaped life paths. Courtiers were trained to anticipate reactions, mediate crises, and manage the emotional environment with calm, almost ritualized precision. Imagine a small child crying quietly in a grand hall while attendants subtly rearrange furniture, adjust lighting, and murmur reassurance, all to maintain the appearance of composure. It's quietly surreal, almost hypnotic in its meticulousness. Moving north again, the Scandinavian royal families produced children who were outwardly competent but often inwardly constrained by strict expectations. Rules dictated schooling, behavior, marriage prospects, and even daily schedules. Those who deviated, whether due to temperament, health, or curiosity, were gently, sometimes painfully corrected. Over time, this created a population of royals who were superficially polished, but often fragile or emotionally restrained. There's a subtle irony here. Centuries of careful management produced individuals who could operate smoothly in ceremonial contexts but might struggle in informal life. Think of it as highly curated performance skills over actual robustness. We can also observe subtle contrasts in temperament. Some royals became exceptionally disciplined, mirroring the precision of their upbringing. Others rebelled quietly, experimenting with minor eccentricities or indulgences, collecting oddities, pursuing improbable hobbies, or simply refusing to conform fully to routine. These small deviations, though inconsequential politically, add layers to the story. They reveal the human element behind the rigid protocols, the same way minor airflow adjustments can subtly affect the final shade of an indigo-dyed cloth. And of course, portraits served as a kind of slow-motion storytelling device. Painters were expected to smooth over imperfections, highlight beauty, and conceal quirks. But occasionally, tiny details betrayed reality. A slightly awkward hand placement, a faint hint of tremor, or a subtly uneven posture. In some ways, these details are the historical equivalent of noticing that a fabric has cooled unevenly in one corner. The observers who knew what to look for, family members, close courtiers, understood the subtleties, while the general public only saw the idealized version. Even minor physical peculiarities, such as pronounced jawlines, curved spines, or unusually delicate hands, were quietly managed. Tutors adjusted posture, courtiers adjusted seating arrangements, and the children learned, slowly, to navigate the constraints placed upon them. There's a quiet, almost hypnotic quality to observing this slow dance of human adaptation. Compared to the dramatic crises often highlighted in textbooks, this is a subtler, more continuous form of challenge, one managed with patience, observation, and ritualized intervention. And so, the pattern emerges. Across dynasties, across centuries, the combination of genetic fragility, obsessive management, and ceremonial protocol produces a tableau of subtle, ongoing interventions. Each day involves small adjustments, gentle guidance, and careful observation. Children grow up under constant supervision, habits are meticulously cultivated, and minor crises are quietly resolved. Viewed calmly, the entire system resembles a slow, controlled experiment in human behavior, one where the stakes are both trivial and monumental, depending on perspective. Now let's float gently into the world of royal children, which, unsurprisingly, was a mix of privilege, pressure, and predictable fragility. One of the most striking aspects of life for these young royals was the almost obsessive structure imposed on them. From the moment they could walk, their days were dictated by tutors, attendants, and a seemingly endless schedule of lessons, etiquette, and ceremonial practice. Play, in the sense that most of us understand it, was limited. Instead, a child might spend hours learning to bow correctly, memorizing genealogies, or practicing the perfect hand gesture for receiving a visiting dignitary. Take, for example, the children of Louis XIV. Even as toddlers, they were subjected to meticulously timed routines, supervised by nurses, governesses, and court officials. Every meal, nap, and moment of play, or structured learning, was recorded, adjusted, and enforced with precision. Illness, minor tantrums, or accidental missteps were quietly corrected, often without emotional acknowledgement. It's the kind of environment that breeds a certain type of calm, controlled behavior, albeit at the expense of childhood spontaneity. One can almost imagine a little prince carefully adjusting his tiny cuffs, muttering silently about minor infractions, while the sunlight drifts through the palace windows in slow, golden arcs. The Habsburg children experienced similar, if more genetically complicated, regimens. Many were physically frail due to repeated inbreeding, which meant that attendants had to anticipate health crises before they occurred. One might imagine a young archduke, half sleeping in a velvet-covered crib, as nurses adjust blankets, monitor his pulse, and quietly note any irregularities. It's not the most dramatic image, but there's a certain hypnotic quality to it, the rhythm of slow, continuous observation, with life unfolding under meticulous care. Temperament, of course, mattered just as much as physical health. Some children were naturally shy or anxious. Others were exuberant, stubborn, or prone to minor fits of frustration. These behaviors were generally corrected with gentle intervention rather than punishment. Courtiers and tutors learned to anticipate emotional swings, adjusting routines, schedules, or attention accordingly. In this environment, eccentricities could flourish quietly, almost like small, unpredictable ripples on a calm pond. Let's linger for a moment on education. Royal children were expected to master languages, philosophy, etiquette, history, music, and sometimes military training, all before reaching adolescence. The schedule was relentless, and tutors often reported progress, or lack thereof, in meticulous detail. Mistakes, whether academic or behavioral, were quietly noted and corrected with small interventions, rather than loud reprimands. There's a subtle, soothing pattern in this continuous adjustment, slow, almost hypnotic, a rhythm of observation and correction that leaves little room for surprise. Physical development was also carefully managed. Court physicians monitored growth, diet, and even posture, ensuring that children adhered to an idealized standard of health. In Habsburg and Bourbon families, this could involve adjusting sleeping arrangements, timing meals precisely, or implementing gentle exercises to correct skeletal alignment. The result was a kind of carefully choreographed bodily development, almost like a human equivalent of the patient, methodical cooling of indigo-dyed fabric. Small, deliberate interventions produced steady, predictable outcomes, usually. And yet, even with all this meticulous oversight, fragility remained a constant companion. Disease, infection, and minor ailments could swiftly escalate, and mortality rates were high. Royal parents, tutors, and attendants developed an almost ritualized calm in response. They observed, adjusted, and waited, all the while maintaining the serene appearance expected by courtly protocol. There's something quietly mesmerizing about this slow, continuous management of life, each adjustment small, deliberate, almost hypnotic in its repetition. Temperament quirks, too, required management. Some children became obsessively neat, compulsively repetitive, or absorbed in minor details, while others exhibited impulsive or unpredictable behavior. Courtiers learned to accommodate these eccentricities without drawing attention, ensuring that the child could function within ceremonial contexts. The slow rhythm of correction and adaptation created a steady pattern, a kind of living choreography that balanced natural variation with imposed order. Siblings added another layer of complexity. Rivalries were common, as were subtle alliances and quiet manipulations. In some dynasties, older children were groomed to guide or control younger siblings, while the youngest were often indulged or protected excessively. This created a dynamic environment, where subtle social navigation was necessary for survival and success. Observing it calmly, one can see a pattern of delicate, continuous adjustment, almost like the careful positioning of cloth to capture the right breeze during cooling. Play, when it existed, was carefully structured. Games were often designed to teach etiquette, strategic thinking, or poise. A young prince might engage in mock battles or intellectual exercises under the watchful eye of a tutor. Small competitions were staged to encourage skill development, but unstructured, spontaneous play was rare. The environment, quiet and controlled, fostered both discipline and occasional eccentricity, as children adapted to the rigid expectations around them. Illnesses, both minor and serious, were treated with calm attentiveness. Attendants learned to anticipate fevers, digestive issues, or respiratory problems, responding with gentle interventions rather than panic. This slow, measured care resembles the patient manipulation of drying fabric. Minor adjustments, continuous observation, subtle corrections. Life, in this context, was a slow, steady rhythm of attention and adaptation. Now, let's consider courtly appearance. Clothing, posture, and grooming were strictly monitored. Every fold of a garment, every strand of hair, every minor detail of presentation mattered. Children learned from an early age that appearances were carefully curated, and any deviation could elicit quiet correction. In this way, daily life was both performance and education, a continuous rehearsal of poise and control. There's a hypnotic repetition in these routines, a slow unfolding of habits that shapes personality over time. Diet was another area of meticulous attention. Meals were designed to promote health, growth, and refinement. Courtiers and physicians monitored intake carefully, adjusting for age, temperament, and physical condition. Even minor indulgences were allowed selectively, often to encourage compliance or reward minor achievements. The rhythm of daily meals, combined with structured activity and careful monitoring, created a predictable cadence, fostering steady development in both body and mind. One might imagine a scene where a young princess, seated at a sunlit table, delicately manipulates her fork under watchful eyes, while tutors take notes, and attendants make subtle adjustments to seating and lighting. It's a quiet ballet of control, a measured choreography designed to produce both aesthetic and social refinement. The scene is soothing in its predictability, if faintly melancholy in its constrained creativity. And yet, despite all precautions, human unpredictability persisted. Some children resisted routines, developed unexpected illnesses, or simply displayed temperament variations that defied careful planning. Courtiers responded with gentle adjustment, tutors made minor interventions, and parents maintained calm oversight. The entire system functioned like a slow, deliberate mechanism, absorbing minor shocks without dramatic upheaval. It's a quiet, hypnotic pattern, a living illustration of patience, observation, and continuous refinement. Let's briefly consider the emotional dimension. Many royal children experienced loneliness, isolation, or subtle anxiety, consequences of highly controlled upbringing. Courtiers and attendants often became surrogate companions, providing emotional scaffolding through gentle interaction, careful attention, and structured socialization. Small comforts, stories, soft music, or minor indulgences were used to stabilize mood and reinforce the desired patterns of behavior. This quiet management of emotion mirrors, in some ways, the careful monitoring and adjustment of fabric during the cooling process, subtle interventions over time, producing a steady, balanced outcome. Finally, let's reflect on mortality and fragility. Despite all interventions, many royal children did not survive to adulthood. High infant mortality, disease, and inherited vulnerabilities were common. The response of families and courtiers was generally calm, ritualized, and procedural. Mourning was observed according to custom, but life continued in the slow, steady rhythm of courtly routine. Observed from a distance, these patterns are hypnotic in their regularity, almost meditative in their quiet acceptance of the limits imposed by biology and circumstance. And so, in the lives of these royal children, we see a world defined by careful management, subtle intervention, and slow, continuous adjustment. Health, behavior, and appearance were monitored and guided with almost ritualistic precision. Failures were quietly corrected, eccentricities gently accommodated, and life unfolded in a steady, measured rhythm. Observing this calmly, without drama, one can sense a slow, hypnotic flow, a rhythm of human patience, subtle control, and enduring adaptation. Let's float gently over to the adult lives of these royals, where early fragility and carefully managed childhoods often gave way to eccentric or quietly tragic adult behaviors. Take Charles VI of France, famously called Charles the Mad. He spent years oscillating between lucidity and deep psychosis. Court life didn't pause for him. The courtiers adapted, shuffling responsibilities quietly, observing him with cautious attentiveness, and ensuring protocol continued without overt disruption. It's a strangely hypnotic tableau, a king alternating between moments of extreme clarity and the occasional delusion, while the machinery of court hums steadily along. Charles would sometimes lock himself in rooms, convinced the floor was made of glass or that he had turned to stone. Courtiers responded with patience and ritualized routines, escorting him gently, adjusting furniture, and arranging meetings around these episodes. There's something almost soothing in the methodical, quiet response to chaos, like slowly adjusting a stubborn piece of indigo cloth until it finally aligns with the wind. Life continued, careful, measured, and oddly serene despite the underlying instability. Moving to Spain, we encounter Philip II, whose obsessive attention to detail and control extended to every corner of his empire. He monitored correspondence with extreme precision, imposed meticulous routines on his household, and often micromanaged affairs of state. Yet personally, he was famously melancholic, prone to mood swings, and deeply lonely. Courtiers learned to navigate his temper quietly, offering subtle guidance rather than direct confrontation. Observed from a distance, his life resembles a carefully managed experiment in control and response, punctuated by occasional personal misery. Now, consider Elizabeth I of England. She's often celebrated as a brilliant ruler, and she was, but also deeply eccentric. The Queen maintained absolute control over her personal image, ritualized court entertainments, and the private lives of her attendants. Portraits, carefully staged, concealed any minor imperfection. Yet behind the official persona, Elizabeth was meticulous about small details, managing correspondence personally, controlling visitors, and cultivating a precise daily routine. Her court learned to anticipate moods, manage deviations, and maintain calm protocol at all times. There's a hypnotic rhythm in this constant interplay of precision, observation, and minor intervention, akin to the patient adjustment of cooling indigo cloth. And then there's the curious case of Peter the Great of Russia, a man simultaneously visionary and socially awkward. He imposed sweeping reforms, modernized his country, and personally involved himself in nearly every aspect of life at court. Yet socially he was prone to bluntness, occasional cruelty, and obsessive attention to detail. Courtiers adapted, learning to predict his reactions, adjust conversation topics, and anticipate whims. Life at the Russian court was a continuous dance of subtle correction and quiet adaptation, a pattern repeated endlessly, producing a hypnotic rhythm of human management. The lives of these monarchs were also punctuated by personal tragedies that quietly shaped daily routines. Children born with fragility, spouses prone to illness, or relatives whose behavior required constant supervision became part of a slow, continuous flow of attention. Courtiers and attendants were trained to maintain appearances while managing real human vulnerability. It's a kind of hypnotic choreography, minor interventions, small adjustments, and continuous observation, producing stability from fragility. Let's drift for a moment to the eccentricities of minor nobles. Across Europe, countless lesser aristocrats developed peculiar habits in response to their controlled environments. Some became obsessive collectors, others cultivated strange hobbies, and a few invented elaborate personal rituals to impose order on their constrained lives. These habits, observed from a calm distance, reveal a gentle pattern, humans seeking mastery and control in small, repetitive ways, producing quiet, hypnotic rhythms across generations. Even something as mundane as daily grooming became ritualized. Royal and noble children learned to dress themselves with precision, adjust hair and clothing carefully, and manage posture for both health and appearance. Tutors monitored minor deviations, offering gentle correction and maintaining the steady flow of routine. There's a subtle hypnotic quality to observing these repeated interventions, a quiet cadence that shapes human behavior over time. And yet unpredictability persisted. Despite careful management, illnesses struck, moods fluctuated, and temperament quirks occasionally disrupted carefully choreographed routines. Courtiers responded with measured interventions, adjusting schedules, and managing perception without overt drama. Life was slow, continuous, and meticulously monitored, like the patient adjustment of a piece of fabric in a gentle breeze. The rhythm is quiet, calming, and oddly hypnotic when observed from a detached perspective. Consider the eccentricities of Louis XV's later years. The king cultivated personal indulgences, managed a private network of lovers, and maintained strict ceremonial routines simultaneously. His courtiers learned to navigate the subtle balance of public and private behavior, adjusting their own actions with patience and observation. Small interventions prevented major disruptions, producing a slow, hypnotic stability amid the otherwise chaotic pressures of court life. There's a faintly amusing, almost soothing rhythm in watching human adaptation performed with such meticulous care. Meanwhile, minor princes and princesses navigated similar challenges on smaller scales. Childhood habits, education, and social interactions were carefully monitored, producing a slow, continuous pattern of adaptation. Eccentricities were corrected quietly, illnesses managed subtly, and emotional volatility accommodated with calm intervention. Viewed from a distance, these patterns resemble a gentle, hypnotic choreography, where repeated observation and adjustment create enduring stability. And then there's the quiet tragedy of dynastic mortality. Across centuries, countless children and adults succumbed to illness, accidents, or inherited fragility. Families maintained appearances, rituals continued, and life persisted with hypnotic regularity. Mourning and care were ritualized, producing a slow, predictable rhythm of human adaptation and emotional management. The process is steady, calming, and oddly meditative in its repetitive precision. Let's float over to the minor details, peculiar habits and personal quirks. Some nobles developed obsessive cleaning rituals, others arranged objects in strict patterns, and a few became preoccupied with inconsequential details of court etiquette. These behaviors, while eccentric, functioned as mechanisms to impose control over otherwise constrained lives. Courtiers adapted, intervening subtly when necessary, maintaining a slow, continuous flow of order. Observed from a distance, the scene is almost hypnotic, repeated, small interventions shaping behavior in a gentle, predictable rhythm. Education continued to shape personality, temperament, and social skill. Lessons in history, etiquette, languages, and philosophy were delivered with ritualized regularity, producing predictable patterns of behavior. Courtiers and tutors managed deviations, offering gentle corrections and ensuring the smooth operation of social and ceremonial systems. It's a quiet, continuous process, hypnotic in its repetition, and oddly soothing when observed as a rhythm of human adaptation. Even court entertainments contributed to this hypnotic flow. Music, dance, and structured games served both to educate and to socialize, teaching discipline, coordination, and awareness of social cues. Children and adults alike participated in carefully timed, ritualized activities designed to reinforce expected behaviors. Minor eccentricities were corrected gently, and observers learned to anticipate subtle disruptions. The result is a steady, meditative rhythm of attention, intervention, and adaptation. And so, the adult lives of royals and nobles reveal a world of continuous, slow adjustments, physical care, emotional management, social training, and ceremonial discipline. Minor eccentricities, illnesses, and temperament variations are handled with patience, subtlety, and ritualized attention. Observed calmly, the system is hypnotic in its regularity, almost meditative in its gentle rhythm of human adaptation. Finally, consider the quiet absurdity of dynastic obsession, generations of careful bloodline management, meticulous observation, and constant intervention producing fragile, eccentric, or sometimes tragically short-lived individuals. Protocol, etiquette, and ceremonial life continue without pause, sustained by the steady rhythm of courtiers, tutors, and attendants. Life is simultaneously constrained and managed, chaotic and ordered, trivial and monumental, a gentle dance of human persistence and adaptation, performed slowly over centuries. Let's drift now into the peculiar world of royal marriages, where dynastic ambition, political calculation, and human frailty intersected in slow, sometimes tragic ways. One of the most persistent patterns was the insistence on cousin or close relative unions. This wasn't merely tradition, it was an almost ritualized obsession with consolidating power, wealth, and territorial claims. The result? A long parade of marriages that, from a modern perspective, often seemed absurd, tragic, or both simultaneously. Take, for example, the Habsburgs once more. They perfected the art of intermarriage, ensuring that practically every European noble family tree eventually looped back on itself. The phrase, "keep it in the family," was literal, and the consequences were predictable: fragile heirs, pronounced physical peculiarities, and, in some cases, cognitive limitations. Charles II of Spain, again, stands as the prime example. His inability to perform even basic physical tasks was not hidden, but the dynastic imperatives left little room for mercy or deviation. Courtiers managed every minor detail of his life with meticulous care, producing a hypnotic, almost ritualized pattern of intervention. Meanwhile, in France, the Bourbons conducted similar marital experiments. Alliances were negotiated with extreme precision, sometimes requiring betrothals of toddlers, half-siblings, or first cousins. The children involved were expected to grow into their roles, navigating a labyrinth of expectations, ceremonies, and public appearances. Illness, minor eccentricities, or even temperament quirks were quietly managed by attendants, tutors, and family members, ensuring that the slow rhythm of dynastic continuity remained unbroken. It's fascinating to observe how minor personal quirks could magnify under the pressures of these marriages. Some children were naturally shy, others exuberant or mischievous. These traits, often inconsequential in ordinary life, became magnified in a courtly environment where every movement, every glance, and every expression was scrutinized. Courtiers learned to anticipate reactions, correct minor deviations, and maintain calm appearances, producing a gentle, hypnotic cadence of attention and adaptation. Consider the case of Maria Theresa of Austria, whose children were married strategically across Europe. The goal was political influence, but the process required years of careful management. Children were groomed, monitored, and guided to ensure compliance with dynastic objectives. Even minor failures in etiquette or behavior were addressed quietly but systematically. From a distance, The entire system resembles the slow, deliberate process of cooling indigo-dyed fabric, subtle adjustments, continuous observation, and the patient shaping of outcomes. And yet, despite careful planning, human unpredictability persisted. Marriages could fail emotionally, spouses could resist expectations, and children sometimes refused, or were incapable of, fulfilling roles assigned by dynastic necessity. Courtiers and family members responded with gentle intervention, attempting to steer outcomes without causing disruption. There's a strangely calming rhythm in this endless adjustment, a continuous balancing of human nature against imposed structure. Take a moment to observe the domestic habits of these households. Royal apartments, kitchens, and even sleeping quarters were arranged according to strict protocol. Children, spouses, and attendants all adhered to carefully choreographed routines. Minor eccentricities, such as a habit of tapping fingers, rearranging objects, or unusual sleep positions, were quietly accommodated or corrected. The rhythm of daily life, though constrained, was consistent, hypnotic, and strangely soothing in its predictability. We can also notice the subtler personal tragedies embedded in these marital arrangements. Children married for political advantage often endured emotional loneliness, isolation, or unfulfilled desires. Spouses might be physically or emotionally incompatible, yet separation or refusal to comply with dynastic objectives was rarely an option. The slow accumulation of minor disappointments, tempered by careful intervention, produced adults who were functional, if quietly constrained. The rhythm of adaptation continued, almost meditative in its continuity. Even minor nobles faced echoes of these pressures. Across Europe, the obsession with lineage and status created environments where minor eccentricities were amplified and carefully monitored. Obsessive habits, quirky behaviors, and small physical frailties were managed with calm attention, producing a steady rhythm of adaptation and correction. The result is a quiet, hypnotic tableau of human persistence under subtle constraint. And yet, these carefully choreographed lives were punctuated by occasional bursts of absurdity. Some children developed unusual hobbies, such as collecting miniature objects, obsessively cataloging items, or creating elaborate games of strategy and ceremony. Adults, constrained by dynastic obligations, sometimes pursued eccentric indulgences, private gardens meticulously maintained, bizarre culinary experiments, or strange rituals designed to impose order on otherwise uncontrollable circumstances. The court adapted to these idiosyncrasies with patient tolerance, maintaining a slow, continuous rhythm of intervention and accommodation. Let's drift over to England for a moment. The Stuarts, particularly during the reign of Charles I, experienced a combination of political upheaval and domestic eccentricity. Charles was deeply sensitive to courtly protocol and personal slights, and his family members displayed a range of fragile temperaments and minor eccentricities. Courtiers managed these variables with careful observation, subtle intervention, and routine, producing a steady, hypnotic rhythm amidst the turbulence of politics. Even small deviations, a poorly timed gesture, a mispronounced word, or a minor lapse in etiquette, were quietly corrected, maintaining the equilibrium of the household. Education, too, played a significant role in shaping personal eccentricities. Tutors and governesses delivered lessons in etiquette, languages, music, and social skill with ritualized regularity. Children adapted to these patterns, developing predictable behaviors and subtle coping mechanisms. Small quirks persisted, often quietly tolerated or subtly corrected, producing a living rhythm of human adaptation that, observed from a distance, is almost meditative in its repetition. And there's an irony in these lives. The very traits that courtiers and families worked so carefully to manage, fragility, eccentricity, temperament quirks, were often what made certain monarchs memorable in history. The Habsburg jaw, the melancholic disposition, the obsessive precision, or the tiny eccentricities of behavior all became markers of dynastic identity. They are the traces of slow, careful human management, recorded in portraits, letters, and chronicles. Observing them calmly, one can sense a rhythm, small adjustments repeated over decades, producing outcomes that are quietly hypnotic in their continuity. Even minor aspects of daily life carried significance. Hand gestures, posture, and voice modulation were all trained from a young age. Children and adults alike adapted to subtle social cues, producing a steady flow of behavior that maintained courtly equilibrium. Courtiers monitored these rhythms, adjusting subtly to maintain appearances and minimize disruptions. It's a hypnotic dance of observation, intervention, and adaptation, a slow-moving choreography that shaped both personality and social reality. And yet, despite the constant rhythm of management, tragedy persisted. Illness, premature death, and emotional isolation remained common features of dynastic life. Courtiers responded with ritualized care, family members with gentle guidance, and the household maintained its slow, measured routines. There is a subtle, almost meditative quality to this repetition, a constant adaptation to fragility, a gentle balancing of expectation against reality, a quiet rhythm that continues through generations. Finally, let's consider the quiet absurdity of ceremonial excess. Balls, parades, and court entertainments were designed to project power, beauty, and order. Yet beneath the glittering surface, life remained carefully controlled, with every gesture, word, and movement monitored. Minor eccentricities, illness, or temperament quirks were managed subtly, maintaining the hypnotic flow of appearances. Observed from a distance, this dance is both absurd and soothing, humans performing continuous, careful adjustments to produce a sense of stability, beauty, and ritualized perfection. Let's drift now toward the curious case of monarchs whose personal eccentricities almost defined entire dynasties. Take, for example, George III of England, who is often remembered for bouts of what was probably porphyria, a genetic condition that caused periods of severe mental disturbance. He oscillated between clarity and deep confusion, often struggling to manage both personal affairs and the expectations of a restless empire. Courtiers quietly adjusted routines, prepared for mood swings, and monitored behavior with a patient rhythm that almost resembles the careful, hypnotic monitoring of delicate fabric as it cools. Life continued, slow and deliberate, a steady cadence despite the occasional crisis. Similarly, Charles VI of France, the Mad, had periods of extreme delusion, famously imagining that he was made of glass. He refused to move suddenly, fearing shattering, and spent hours carefully maneuvering through rooms. Attendants adapted with quiet precision, ensuring that no one startled him, adjusting furniture and timing movements around his peculiarities. Observing this calmly, one notices a gentle rhythm of patience, a slow-moving choreography of human intervention, subtle and continuous. In Bavaria, Maximilian I's children were often described as delicate, eccentric, or slow to develop. Courtiers and tutors created elaborate systems to guide education, behavior, and even minor daily routines. Children were monitored carefully, with minor deviations noted and corrected. It's hypnotic in its consistency, small, repeated interventions shaping outcomes over years, producing adults who were superficially competent yet internally constrained. The rhythm is subtle, continuous, and strangely soothing when viewed from a distance. Let's float over to the Italian peninsula, where the Medici produced rulers and nobles whose lives were equally defined by subtle eccentricities and constrained personal freedom. Children were educated rigorously, taught to navigate complex social hierarchies, and closely monitored for health and behavior. Minor oddities, stammering, shy gestures, or obsessive tendencies were quietly managed, producing a rhythm of attention and correction that echoes across generations. Observed calmly, the repetition is hypnotic, a slow, steady flow of small, deliberate adjustments. Even in seemingly minor details, the patterns of adaptation persisted. Eating habits, posture, and daily hygiene were meticulously monitored. Children learned to navigate formalized routines while balancing personal quirks. Courtiers acted as subtle guides, correcting deviations with gentle interventions, producing a continuous flow of stability amid the ever-present fragility of youth. This subtle choreography is oddly meditative in its rhythm, like the careful layering and monitoring of cooling indigo fabric, slow, deliberate, and precise. Now, consider the eccentricities of personal hobbies and private indulgences. Many monarchs developed seemingly trivial obsessions, collecting miniature objects, cataloging curiosities, cultivating rare plants, or studying unusual animals. These pursuits, while eccentric, offered structure, personal satisfaction, and a controlled outlet for creativity. Courtiers accommodated these indulgences carefully, adjusting schedules and routines to maintain courtly equilibrium. Observed from a distance, the rhythm is subtle and soothing, continuous small adjustments supporting a slow, steady flow of life. Moving north again, Scandinavian monarchs exhibited similar patterns. Children and adults alike were constrained by rigid expectations yet developed minor eccentricities or obsessive habits. Courtiers and attendants learned to manage these quietly, maintaining appearances while adapting to temperament quirks. It's a steady rhythm of small interventions, a hypnotic flow that balances constraint with human unpredictability. Even the smallest deviation, a gesture, an expression, a momentary lapse, was noted and corrected gently. And then there are the tragic cases, where inbreeding, fragile health, and social expectation collided disastrously. Charles II of Spain is the archetypal example, but numerous other royal families produced similarly delicate heirs. Physical deformities, cognitive limitations, and recurring illness were quietly managed, with attendants, tutors, and physicians orchestrating daily life. The rhythm of intervention, observation, and subtle correction is hypnotic in its predictability, producing adults who could perform ceremonial functions yet remained profoundly constrained by circumstance. Consider the minor daily tragedies: a child succumbing to fever, a minor illness disrupting routine, or a subtle mood swing requiring careful adaptation. Courtiers responded with ritualized calm, adjusting meals, schedules, and social interactions to maintain equilibrium. Life continued, slow and deliberate, the pattern repeating gently, endlessly, across generations. There's a quiet, meditative quality to this repetition, humans managing humans with continuous, subtle care. Let's drift toward the more ironic aspects. Some monarchs who were expected to embody strength, decisiveness, and charm turned out to be fragile, eccentric, or awkward. Physical peculiarities, pronounced jaws, curved spines, or unusually delicate hands, were masked in portraits and public appearances. Behavior quirks, shyness, obsession, or temperamental volatility were corrected quietly. The rhythm of adjustment, observation, and intervention becomes hypnotic, continuous, subtle, and almost meditative in its repetition. Even minor domestic routines were influenced by eccentricity. Sleeping arrangements, lighting, meal timing, and furniture placement were monitored and adjusted. Children learned to adapt to these constraints, while courtiers and attendants gently guided behavior. Small interventions produced predictable outcomes, maintaining calm appearances despite underlying fragility. Life unfolded slowly, like the careful manipulation of delicate materials over time, deliberate, rhythmic, and quiet. Education continued to shape personality and temperament. Language lessons, music practice, social training, and etiquette reinforced subtle patterns of behavior. Deviations were corrected gently, eccentricities accommodated, and the slow rhythm of adaptation continued. Courtiers monitored, tutors instructed, and children learned to navigate carefully, producing adults capable of ceremonial function but often internally constrained. The rhythm is hypnotic in its repetition, small interventions accumulating over time to shape outcomes subtly. Now, marriages again, where dynastic necessity collided with personal preference, or lack thereof. Children were betrothed at young ages, often to distant cousins or political allies. Emotional compatibility was secondary, sometimes tertiary, to strategic calculation. Spouses learned to navigate each other's quirks, fragility, and temperament, while courtiers facilitated interactions with quiet patience. The rhythm is subtle, minor adjustments, careful observation, and gentle guidance maintaining appearances over decades. And yet, unpredictability remained. Some marriages produced extraordinary harmony, others quiet dissatisfaction, and a few outright disasters. Courtiers adapted continuously, managing interactions, correcting minor deviations and sustaining calm appearances. There's a faintly hypnotic quality in this ongoing management, a slow, deliberate adjustment of social, emotional, and ceremonial variables to maintain equilibrium. Finally, minor nobles and lesser royals mirrored these patterns on smaller scales. Obsessive routines, eccentric habits, and carefully managed social interactions were common. Courtiers, tutors, and family members intervened subtly, producing a continuous, gentle flow of stability. Observed from a distance, the entire system is hypnotic, a slow, quiet rhythm of human management, adaptation, and ritualized care, quietly repeated across generations. Let's float gently into some of the more peculiar incidents that pepper royal histories, moments that are quietly absurd when observed from a distance, but were deeply consequential in their time. Take, for instance, the curious case of the Habsburg wedding ceremonies. In many instances, young brides were barely teenagers, dressed in elaborate gowns, and expected to perform an intricate choreography of greetings, bows, and public smiles. One misstep, a stumble, a delayed curtsy, or an awkward glance, could provoke whispered commentary in the galleries. Courtiers and attendants were ready to intervene subtly, adjusting posture, guiding hands, and timing movement to restore perfection. There's a hypnotic rhythm in this constant adjustment, a slow, almost meditative flow of human management. Meanwhile, consider the eccentricities of the French court under Louis XV. The king maintained personal indulgences alongside meticulous ceremonial routines. Courtiers learned to anticipate odd hours, private whims, and the occasional abrupt directive. Small interventions, adjusting lighting, guiding conversation, or redirecting attention, preserved the slow rhythm of courtly life. Observed without drama, the pattern is almost soothing, subtle adjustments repeated over time, maintaining a fragile equilibrium. Now, take the curious case of minor illness and overcaution. Royal children were often physically fragile, prone to minor ailments that could escalate unexpectedly. Courtiers and physicians developed extensive monitoring protocols. A slight fever could trigger a cascade of adjustments, changing blankets, adjusting diet, timing medicine precisely, and altering daily activities. The entire household synchronized with these rhythms, producing a hypnotic cadence of patient intervention. Even minor deviations were quietly corrected, ensuring continuity and stability. And then there were personal habits that, while trivial to outsiders, became subtly significant. Some monarchs developed obsessive cleanliness routines, others collected minute curiosities, and a few became preoccupied with tiny objects arranged in strict patterns. Courtiers learned to accommodate these behaviors, adjusting schedules and managing interactions with patient precision. The rhythm of care and adaptation continued gently, producing a steady, calming flow of human management. Let's drift toward the minor absurdities of ceremonial life. Balls, parades, and court entertainments followed rigid scripts. Children and adults were trained to participate with precision, gestures timed carefully, postures maintained, and glances calibrated. Even minor eccentricities, a dropped fan, a misaligned bow, or a slightly off-pitch musical note, were managed with subtle intervention. The slow, deliberate rhythm of adjustment produced an almost meditative quality, repeated small actions maintaining stability and aesthetic cohesion. Meanwhile, marriage arrangements often magnified minor eccentricities. Young children were betrothed for political reasons, frequently to distant cousins or family allies. Emotional compatibility was secondary, leaving personal temperament quirks and physical frailties to be quietly managed. Courtiers and family members guided interactions with gentle patience, subtly correcting behavior to maintain the delicate balance of appearances. Life proceeded slowly, continuously adjusted, like a carefully choreographed dance. Consider, too, the eccentric hobbies of adults in royal households. Some pursued miniature collections, others catalogued curiosities, and a few engaged in obscure studies or artistic experiments. Courtiers accommodated these indulgences, adjusting daily routines and ceremonial schedules to maintain calm appearances. Observed from a distance, there's a subtle rhythm, small, repeated interventions harmonizing individual eccentricity with social expectation. Even minor details of daily life carried significance. The timing of meals, posture at the table, the alignment of furniture, and the arrangement of clothing were all closely monitored. Children and adults learned to adapt. Courtiers intervened subtly, and life continued in a gentle, hypnotic cadence. Deviations were minor, but the rhythm of correction and adjustment was constant, producing a quiet, soothing flow. Illness and mortality were ever-present companions. Royal children and adults alike faced fragile health, sometimes succumbing to minor or serious conditions. Courtiers responded with ritualized care, family members provided gentle support, and routines continued with measured patience. Observed from a distance, these repeated interventions form a slow, meditative pattern: continuous adaptation, quiet management, and subtle correction. And yet, unpredictability persisted. Some children resisted training, exhibited sudden mood swings, or developed unexpected physical issues. Courtiers and attendants responded with patient intervention, maintaining appearances and sustaining ceremonial flow. The rhythm is subtle but continuous, a gentle cadence of observation, adjustment, and maintenance that persists across generations. Now, let's consider the ironic contrasts. Many monarchs expected to embody strength, decisiveness, and charisma were outwardly fragile, socially awkward, or eccentric. Courtiers managed appearances, corrected behavior gently, and maintained calm equilibrium. Physical peculiarities, pronounced jaws, curved spines, or delicate hands, were concealed. Behavior quirks, shyness, obsessive routines, or minor emotional volatility were accommodated. The rhythm of subtle intervention produces a hypnotic, meditative quality, a slow, continuous flow of human management. Even the smallest domestic routines required careful attention. Lighting, bedding, meal timing, and room arrangement were adjusted daily. Children and adults learned to navigate these constraints while maintaining proper decorum. Courtiers intervened subtly to guide behavior and maintain appearances. Observed calmly, the pattern is hypnotic, a gentle, continuous cadence of adjustment, patience, and intervention. Education also reinforced the rhythm. Lessons in languages, music, history, and etiquette were delivered with strict regularity. Minor mistakes were corrected gently, eccentricities quietly tolerated, and children gradually internalized the routines. The rhythm is repetitive, subtle, and oddly soothing, small adjustments over years producing steady, predictable outcomes. Let's float for a moment to minor scandals and social missteps. Even trivial incidents, a misphrased remark, an awkward gesture, or a slightly ill-timed glance, could ripple through courtly life. Courtiers managed these delicately, restoring calm, correcting behavior, and maintaining appearances. There's a hypnotic quality to this continuous, low-level crisis management, small interventions repeated over time producing subtle, cumulative stability. Finally, the quiet tragedies of dynastic fragility deserve attention. Premature death, illness, and emotional constraint were common. Families, courtiers, and physicians responded with ritualized calm, adjusting routines, schedules, and interactions. Life proceeded slowly, rhythmically, and predictably, with continuous minor interventions sustaining stability. Observed from a detached perspective, the system is mesmerizing in its patience, consistency, and quiet attention. And so, the world of royals, nobles, and dynasties unfolds as a hypnotic tableau: eccentricities managed, routines maintained, minor crises absorbed, and appearances sustained. Small, repeated interventions, gentle guidance, and continuous observation shape life across generations. The rhythm is slow, continuous, and calming, an endless flow of human adaptation, subtle correction, and quiet endurance. Meanwhile, personal libraries were often maintained with obsessive precision. Shelves were arranged according to intricate schemes, manuscripts catalogued with meticulous care, and every book handled delicately to prevent damage. Courtiers, attendants, and even family members adjusted their behavior to avoid disturbing these fragile systems. The slow rhythm of cataloging, rearranging, and carefully observing human and object alike produces a subtle hypnotic pattern, the quiet repetition of attention, correction, and preservation. Let's float over to ceremonial routines, where small errors could ripple quietly through courtly life. A dropped fan, a misaligned bow, or a poorly timed gesture might cause whispers and small interventions, yet the overall flow of life continued uninterrupted. Courtiers gently guided participants back into alignment, maintaining the rhythm of appearances without disruption. Life in this environment is slow, continuous, and strangely soothing when observed from a distance. A meditative cadence of small, repeated corrections. Minor eccentricities among royals often became habitual. Some developed peculiar eating patterns, preferring only certain foods prepared in precise ways. Others rearranged personal objects obsessively or engaged in repeated ritualized actions. Courtiers adapted subtly, making minor adjustments to maintain calm, predictable routines. The rhythm of intervention, repetition, and quiet correction becomes hypnotic, a continuous, slow flow of human management. Now consider minor accidents or frailties. Children and adults alike were prone to falls, fevers, or minor ailments. Courtiers responded with ritualized calm, adjusting schedules, meals, and activities to accommodate these vulnerabilities. The slow cadence of monitoring, intervention, and correction persists across generations, producing a gentle, continuous rhythm of life, small adjustments sustaining stability amid fragility. Even seemingly trivial habits carried subtle significance. Gestures, posture, and facial expressions were closely observed. Children learn to internalize these cues, adjusting behavior to maintain appearances. Courtiers intervened gently when deviations occurred, maintaining the calm, hypnotic rhythm of daily life. Minor eccentricities were tolerated, sometimes encouraged, but always subtly guided. Education remained a core instrument of rhythm. Lessons in music, language, history, and etiquette were delivered consistently, producing predictable patterns of learning and behavior. Deviations were corrected gently, eccentricities quietly accommodated. The slow, repetitive flow of instruction, correction, and adaptation creates a hypnotic cadence, steady, deliberate, and calming in its repetition. Let's drift toward minor domestic absurdities. Royal kitchens, bedrooms, and chambers were carefully managed to prevent disruption. Sleeping arrangements, lighting, and furniture placement followed precise routines. Courtiers intervened subtly to correct misalignments or unexpected behavior. The slow, continuous rhythm of adaptation produces a hypnotic, meditative quality, small, repeated actions maintaining stability across households and generations. Consider marriage arrangements once more. Children were betrothed young, often for strategic reasons, with little regard for personal preference. Minor eccentricities of temperament, appearance, or habit were quietly accommodated or corrected by attendants and family members. The rhythm of adaptation is subtle, slow, and continuous. Adjustments repeated across years to maintain equilibrium, producing adults capable of performing ceremonial duties while constrained by circumstance. Even minor ceremonies were orchestrated with hypnotic precision. Balls, parades, and rituals followed strict choreography. Every gesture, bow, and glance was monitored and subtly corrected. Courtiers maintained the steady rhythm of participation, accommodating eccentricities and ensuring appearances remained flawless. Observed calmly, the pattern is soothing, repetition, subtle intervention, and continuous adjustment producing quiet order from potential chaos. Let's pause for the ironic contrasts of fragility and expectation. Monarchs expected to embody strength, decisiveness, and grace were often physically delicate, socially awkward, or eccentric. Courtiers accommodated these quirks, adjusting routines, correcting minor deviations, and preserving appearances. Small interventions repeated continuously produce a slow, meditative cadence, a gentle rhythm of adaptation, observation, and subtle guidance. Minor illnesses continued to shape daily life. Fevers, digestive complaints, and respiratory issues were monitored closely. Courtiers, physicians, and family members intervened gently, adjusting meals, schedules, and social interactions. The slow repetition of observation, intervention, and correction sustains stability, producing a hypnotic, calming flow of life across generations. Education, domestic management, and ceremonial life interweave to form a continuous rhythm. Children internalized habits, courtiers gently guided behavior, and households maintained appearances with minimal disruption. Minor eccentricities, illnesses, and accidents were managed subtly, producing a slow, continuous flow of stability and adaptation. The pattern is quietly mesmerizing, repeated intervention and careful management sustaining equilibrium across generations. Finally, the quiet tragedies of dynastic fragility deserve reflection. Premature death, emotional isolation, and physical vulnerability were common. Families and courtiers responded with ritualized care, adjusting routines and subtly correcting behavior. Life continued slowly, rhythmically, and predictably, a hypnotic cadence of observation, intervention, and adaptation that persists across centuries. Even minor indulgences, hobbies, collections, or personal routines were integrated into this rhythm. Courtiers adjusted schedules, adapted ceremonies, and accommodated eccentricities, producing a subtle, continuous flow of stability. Observed from a calm distance, the system is meditative, small, repeated actions harmonizing human behavior, appearances, and expectations into a steady, quiet rhythm. And so, the world of minor nobles and royals unfolds as a hypnotic tableau, eccentricities managed, routines maintained, minor crises absorbed, and appearances preserved. The rhythm is slow, continuous, and calming, an endless flow of human adaptation, subtle correction, and quiet endurance. Let's drift now into the quieter, more ironic corners of royal households, where minor indulgences, peculiar routines, and subtle mishaps quietly shaped daily life. Consider the obsessive attention some monarchs paid to personal appearance. Hair, clothing, posture, and even hand gestures were meticulously monitored. Courtiers and attendants adjusted the environment subtly, ensuring that every strand of hair lay correctly, every garment fell in perfect lines, and every gesture conformed to ritualized expectation. Observed from a calm distance, this creates a hypnotic rhythm, small, repeated interventions producing continuity and stability. Meanwhile, minor dietary eccentricities were common. Some monarchs insisted on eating only certain foods prepared in specific ways, while others engaged in ritualized meal patterns. Courtiers quietly adapted to these whims, adjusting menus, timing meals, and monitoring portion sizes. Even seemingly trivial indulgences were integrated into the daily rhythm, producing a slow, continuous cadence of observation, adjustment, and accommodation. Let's float gently over the minor domestic absurdities that repeated across generations. Sleeping arrangements, lighting, room organization, and furniture placement were carefully monitored. Courtiers intervened subtly whenever deviations occurred, ensuring that households maintained calm and predictable patterns. There is a hypnotic cadence to this repetitive, slow choreography, small actions, repeated continuously, producing a quiet, steady rhythm of human management. Even minor accidents and illnesses required delicate attention. Children and adults were prone to falls, fevers, or other minor ailments. Courtiers and attendants responded with ritualized care, adjusting schedules, meals, and interactions. The slow repetition of monitoring, intervention, and correction sustains equilibrium, producing a calming, meditative flow of life across generations. Education remained a subtle instrument of control and rhythm. Lessons in music, languages, etiquette, and history were delivered with ritualized regularity. Minor mistakes were gently corrected, eccentricities quietly accommodated, and children gradually internalized the expected patterns of behavior. Observed calmly, the repetition produces a hypnotic cadence, a steady flow of adjustment shaping both personality and conduct. Marriage arrangements, too, followed slow, deliberate patterns. Children were often betrothed for strategic reasons, frequently to distant cousins or allies, with personal preference a minor consideration. Temperament quirks, fragile health, and eccentric behaviors were quietly managed by attendants and family members. The rhythm of adaptation is subtle, continuous, and gentle, repeated interventions maintaining balance and ceremonial propriety over years. Ceremonial life added another layer of subtle complexity. Balls, parades, and court rituals were performed with meticulous choreography. Every gesture, glance, and bow was monitored, minor errors quietly corrected. Courtiers guided participants, adjusted schedules, and accommodated eccentricities. Observed calmly, the repetition produces a hypnotic, meditative rhythm, small, continuous interventions harmonizing appearances and behavior. Now, let's consider the ironic contrast between expectation and reality. Monarchs were supposed to embody strength, decisiveness, and charm, yet many were physically delicate, socially awkward, or eccentric. Courtiers accommodated these traits, correcting deviations gently, adjusting routines subtly, and maintaining the overall flow of appearances. The rhythm of intervention, observation, and adaptation is slow, continuous, and oddly soothing in its predictability. Minor indulgences were integrated into this rhythm as well. Hobbies, collections, and private routines were tolerated and sometimes encouraged, producing a continuous flow of stability despite eccentricity. Courtiers adjusted schedules and routines to accommodate these behaviors, creating a gentle cadence, repeated, subtle interventions sustaining equilibrium across households and generations. Even minor illnesses or health vulnerabilities were absorbed into daily life. Fevers, digestive issues, and minor ailments prompted careful attention from attendants and physicians. Adjustments to meals, routines, and social interactions were continuous and subtle. Observed from a calm distance, the process is hypnotic, a slow, steady flow of intervention, correction, and patient observation maintaining life's fragile balance. Education continued to produce quiet repetition. Music practice, language lessons, and etiquette training reinforced structured behaviors, while minor mistakes and eccentricities were accommodated or corrected. The rhythm of instruction and adaptation is meditative, repeated, gentle interventions shaping behavior, personality, and social competency over time. Let's float gently to minor social mishaps. A poorly timed gesture, awkward glance, or misphrased remark could ripple quietly through courtly life. Courtiers intervened subtly, restoring calm, correcting behavior, and maintaining appearances. The slow cadence of these interventions, repeated over decades, produces a hypnotic flow, small, continuous adjustments shaping behavior, appearances, and social equilibrium. Even seemingly trivial domestic routines contributed to this hypnotic pattern. Lighting, bedding, room organization, and furniture arrangement were monitored and adjusted with subtlety. Children and adults adapted to these constraints, learning to navigate space, time, and social expectation. Courtiers guided behavior discreetly, ensuring that the household maintained its slow, continuous rhythm of stability. Finally, consider the quiet tragedies and ironies embedded in dynastic life. Premature death, emotional isolation, and physical fragility were common. Families, courtiers, and attendants responded with ritualized care, minor interventions, and gentle correction. Life continued slowly, rhythmically, and predictably, a hypnotic cadence of observation, adaptation, and subtle guidance spanning generations. Even the most trivial eccentricities, tiny personal rituals, obsessive hobbies, or subtle habits, were integrated into this continuous rhythm. Courtiers adjusted schedules, modified routines, and accommodated behaviors, producing a slow, steady flow of equilibrium. Observed calmly, the system is meditative, repeated interventions harmonizing human behavior, appearances, and social expectation into a quiet, enduring rhythm. And so, the quiet absurdities, subtle tragedies, and eccentric indulgences of royal life unfold in a hypnotic tableau. Routines maintained, crises absorbed, appearances preserved, and personalities subtly shaped. The rhythm is slow, continuous, and calming, an endless flow of human adaptation, gentle correction, and quiet endurance across generations. Let's drift now into the world of minor personal eccentricities that quietly shaped courtly life. Many monarchs and nobles developed small but persistent habits, tapping fingers in time with thoughts, arranging personal objects according to idiosyncratic patterns, or repeating gestures with ritualized regularity. Courtiers and attendants quickly learned to accommodate these behaviors, adjusting schedules and routines to maintain calm appearances. Observed from a calm distance, the repetition and subtle intervention creates a hypnotic rhythm, small actions repeated continuously, maintaining stability across households. Meanwhile, minor domestic accidents punctuated daily life. A spilled cup of tea, a tripped step, or a misplaced fan required discreet correction. Courtiers intervened subtly, restoring order without disrupting ceremony. Children learn to anticipate these interventions, internalizing small cues and adapting behavior. Life unfolded slowly, quietly, and predictably, a gentle cadence of observation, minor correction, and continuous adjustment. Education reinforced these rhythms. Lessons in music, languages, etiquette, and history were delivered with precise regularity. Mistakes were corrected gently, eccentricities accommodated with care. Over time, children internalized both content and pattern, producing adults capable of ceremonial performance while remaining constrained by subtle intervention. The rhythm is hypnotic, repeated instruction and gentle correction forming a slow, continuous cadence of social and personal development. Let's float over to minor ceremonial rituals. Balls, parades, and gatherings demanded strict choreography. Gestures, bows, glances, and posture were all monitored and adjusted with subtlety. Even a minor misstep, an offbeat motion, a delayed smile, prompted quiet guidance from attendants. The flow of courtly life continued without disruption, producing a hypnotic, meditative cadence of small interventions harmonizing behavior, appearance, and social expectation. Now, consider the ironic contrast between expectation and personal reality. Monarchs were supposed to embody strength, charm, and decisiveness, yet many were fragile, socially awkward, or eccentric. Courtiers and attendants accommodated these traits, correcting minor deviations and subtly guiding behavior. Observed calmly, the rhythm of continuous adaptation is soothing, a gentle flow of repeated interventions maintaining equilibrium and appearances. Minor indulgences also contributed to the slow rhythm of courtly life. Hobbies, collections, and private routines were quietly tolerated or encouraged. Courtiers adjusted routines, schedules, and ceremonies to accommodate eccentricities. The repeated, subtle intervention creates a continuous cadence, small, deliberate actions harmonizing personal indulgence with social expectation. Even minor illness shaped the flow of daily life. Fevers, digestive complaints, and minor injuries prompted careful attention from attendants, physicians, and family members. Meals, schedules, and social interactions were adjusted subtly, producing a continuous rhythm of intervention, correction, and care. The pattern is slow, meditative, and oddly soothing, a gentle flow of attention maintaining fragile equilibrium. Education, domestic management, and ceremonial life interweave to produce a continuous, hypnotic cadence. Children internalized habits, courtiers subtly guided behavior, households maintained appearances. Minor eccentricities, small illnesses, and trivial accidents were quietly absorbed into the daily rhythm, producing a slow, steady flow of stability and adaptation. Observed calmly, the repetition is meditative, gentle interventions shaping personality, behavior, and social cohesion over time. Let's drift gently to minor social mishaps. A poorly timed remark, awkward glance, or minor breach of etiquette could ripple quietly through courtly life. Courtiers intervened with subtle guidance, restoring calm and correcting behavior. Repetition of these small interventions across decades produced a hypnotic pattern, slow, deliberate, and continuous adjustments sustaining social equilibrium. Even trivial domestic routines contributed to this rhythm. Furniture placement, lighting, bedding, and room organization were monitored and subtly adjusted. Children and adults learned to navigate constraints, internalizing cues and adapting behavior. Courtiers guided behavior gently, ensuring that the household maintained a slow, continuous rhythm of stability, repetition, and predictability. Finally, consider the quiet tragedies of dynastic fragility. Premature death, emotional isolation, and physical weakness were common. Families, courtiers, and attendants responded with ritualized care, gentle correction, and subtle intervention. Life continued slowly, rhythmically, and predictably, a hypnotic cadence of observation, adjustment, and patient management spanning generations. Minor indulgences, hobbies, and personal rituals were fully integrated into this slow rhythm. Courtiers and attendants adjusted schedules and routines, accommodating eccentricities and producing a continuous, subtle flow of stability. Observed calmly, the process is meditative, repeated interventions harmonizing human behavior, appearance, and social expectation into a steady, enduring pattern. And so, the quiet absurdities, minor tragedies, and subtle eccentricities of royal life unfold in a hypnotic tableau. Routines are maintained, crises absorbed, appearances preserved, and personalities subtly shaped. The rhythm is slow, continuous, and calming, an endless flow of human adaptation, gentle correction, and quiet endurance. Let's drift now into the quieter peculiarities of courtly life, where small habits, odd routines, and subtle quirks quietly structured days. Some monarchs, for instance, developed highly specific morning rituals. The timing of waking, the order of washing, the precise manner of arranging clothing, and even the angle of combing hair were all subject to careful observation. Courtiers and attendants adjusted schedules and procedures to accommodate these habits. Observed calmly, this produces a hypnotic rhythm, repeated small interventions, each reinforcing the stability of the household. Meanwhile, minor domestic accidents punctuated life. A dropped utensil, a slightly misplaced candle, or an unevenly set chair could ripple quietly through the daily flow. Courtiers intervened subtly, restoring order without disruption. Children and adults internalized these corrections, anticipating interventions and adjusting behavior. Life moved slowly and predictably, producing a gentle cadence of observation, adaptation, and continuous adjustment. Education continued to reinforce subtle rhythms. Lessons in music, language, etiquette, history, and mathematics were delivered with meticulous regularity. Mistakes were gently corrected, eccentricities quietly accommodated. Over time, children internalized both content and conduct, producing adults capable of ceremonial performance while constrained by subtle interventions. The repetition of instruction and correction creates a hypnotic cadence, small, continuous actions shaping personality, behavior, and social capability over time. Minor ceremonial rituals added another layer of slow, deliberate structure. Balls, parades, and court gatherings demanded precise choreography. Every gesture, bow, and glance was observed and subtly corrected. Even small lapses, a delayed smile, a slightly offbeat motion, prompted discreet guidance. The rhythm of courtly life persisted without interruption, producing a hypnotic, meditative flow of small, continuous interventions harmonizing behavior, appearance, and social expectation. Now, consider the ironic contrast between expectation and reality. Monarchs were often supposed to embody strength, charm, and decisiveness, yet many were fragile, awkward, or eccentric. Courtiers accommodated these traits, correcting minor deviations gently and guiding behavior subtly. Observed calmly, the rhythm of continuous adaptation is soothing, a gentle, continuous flow of interventions maintaining equilibrium and ceremonial appearances. Minor personal indulgences contributed to the slow rhythm as well. Some monarchs engaged in obsessive hobbies, cataloging small curiosities, arranging miniature collections, or studying obscure phenomena. Courtiers adapted schedules, altered routines, and guided interactions to accommodate these indulgences. The result is a subtle, continuous flow, small, repeated interventions harmonizing individual eccentricity with social expectation. Even minor illness shaped household life. Fevers, digestive complaints, and small injuries prompted careful attention from attendants, physicians, and family members. Meals, schedules, and social interactions were adjusted subtly, producing a slow, continuous rhythm of intervention, correction, and care. Observed from a distance, the process is hypnotic, a gentle, steady flow of observation maintaining fragile equilibrium. Education, domestic management, and ceremonial routines interweave to produce a continuous, hypnotic cadence. Children internalized habits, courtiers guided behavior discreetly, households maintained appearances. Minor eccentricities, illnesses, and accidents were quietly absorbed into the daily flow, producing a slow, steady rhythm of stability and adaptation. Observed calmly, the repetition is meditative, gentle interventions shaping personality, behavior, and social cohesion over time. Let's float gently to minor social mishaps. A poorly timed remark, an awkward glance, or a minor breach of etiquette could ripple quietly through courtly life. Courtiers intervened discreetly, restoring calm, correcting behavior, and maintaining appearances. The slow cadence of these interventions, repeated across decades, produces a hypnotic pattern, continuous adjustments sustaining social equilibrium and ceremonial propriety. Even trivial domestic routines contributed to this rhythm. Furniture placement, lighting, bedding, and room organization were monitored and subtly adjusted. Children and adults learned to navigate constraints, internalizing cues and adapting behavior. Courtiers guided behavior quietly, ensuring that the household maintained a slow, continuous rhythm of stability, repetition, and predictability. Finally, consider the quiet tragedies embedded in dynastic fragility. Premature death, emotional isolation, and physical weakness were common. Families, courtiers, and attendants responded with ritualized care, subtle interventions, and gentle correction. Life continued slowly, rhythmically, and predictably, a hypnotic cadence of observation, adaptation, and patient management spanning generations.